Good afternoon again, students. Since proofs are so difficult, I thought I'd actually do some with you in IXL so you can get a feel of what you're seeing and what it's asking. First of all, in a proof, they give you something that you're trying to prove. We want to complete the proof that angle TWX, and if we look down here, TWX, this angle here, is congruent to STW. STW. So we're trying to prove that this angle is congruent to that angle. In so doing, they first must give us something, some type of a given. And our given in that first statement is that SU is parallel to VX. SU is parallel. That's what these two little up and down lines in between these two lines mean, is that they're parallel. Since they are parallel, we know that the corresponding angles postulate holds, which tells us that this angle TWX is congruent to RTU. So this angle here is congruent to this angle because they're corresponding angles. Second, we know that RTU, angle RTU, this angle here, is congruent to angle STW, this angle here. So these two angles are congruent by a vertical angle theorem that I talked about. Vertical angles. Now I know this angle is congruent to this angle, and this angle is congruent to this angle because they're corresponding angles. Thus, through the transitive property of congruency, so they give you an option here. Did we figure this out by algebra, by the reflexive property, by substitution? But no, it was the transitive property. Now be careful here, it's of congruency. If you notice all these little congruent symbols, we're not doing equals, not equality. It's the transitive property of congruency that we have those three angles that are all congruent, thus TWX is congruent to angle STW. And then we find out that we did that correctly. Here's another one where we talk about, again, the object of this one is to prove that RTU, oh no, this is given, angle RTU and angle XWY are supplementary. That's a given. And they say, just with that information, can we prove or complete the proof that the two lines VX and line SU are parallel? Well, let's see if we can do that. First of all, we write down the given. First thing is those two lines are supplementary. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that the measure of angle RTU, now let's find those angles, RTU plus the measure of XWY, that's this angle. So this angle and this angle here must add up to 180 by definition of supplementary angles. Then it goes, all right, well, we know those two are supplementary. We also know that the measure of angle RTU plus the measure of UTW, so that's this angle here and this angle here, we know those add up to 180 because they form a linear pair, and angles forming a linear pair add up to 180. They form this line. Now, we know that the measure of angle RTU plus the measure of angle XWY, which equals 180, also must equal the measure of angle RTU plus the measure of angle UTW, because that also equals 180. In other words, what we did here is we actually just used the transitive property of equality, because we just said this is equal to that, that's equal to that, thus that must be equal to that. It's the transitive property of equality. Now we just use a little algebra. Basically what we did is we minus the measure of angle RTU from both sides. That cancels that, leaving the measure of XWY is equal to the measure of angle UTW, which that means if this angle here, XWY, if it's equal to the measure of UTW, those two angles are congruent and they're corresponding angles. If they're corresponding angles and they're congruent, that must mean those two lines are parallel by the converse of the corresponding angles postulate. Remember, I know the angles. I'm trying to prove the lines parallel. That's called the converse of the corresponding angle postulate. Booyah, we got it. Now let's move on to this next one here. I'm going to do maybe one more. Here it says TV. Okay, complete the proof, first of all, that angle TUW is congruent to angle PRS. So I'm trying to prove this is congruent to that. The given is that the two lines are parallel, which is what these little red tick marks mean, or arrows mean. And we write that down. Line TV is parallel to line QS. The next thing, since they are parallel, we know that corresponding angles are congruent. Thus, angle TUW is congruent to QRU. That's this angle is congruent to this angle because they're corresponding angles. We also know that QRU is congruent to PRS. So that's this angle is congruent to this angle here because they're vertical angles. That's the vertical angle theorem. Now by the transitive property, we know that this angle must be congruent to this one as well, because this one was congruent to this one, that was congruent to that one. So by the transitive property of congruency, we know the two triangles are congruent. Excellent, we're doing great. Now, I want to emphasize that as we move in, they're going to start giving you maybe even two things to write down, two reasons for our proof. So for instance, on this one, it says, complete the proof that the two lines are parallel. WY is parallel to TV. Prove that. And what's given is this angle here, angle VUX is congruent to angle UXW. They've marked them with little red curves. So we know those two are congruent. The next thing it says angle SUT, that's this one underneath, is congruent to angle VUX. How do we know those two angles are congruent? Oh, wait a minute. They're across from each other through an intersection. They're vertical angles. So vertical angle theorem proves that those two are congruent. Then, since that's congruent to that angle and that angle is congruent to that angle, by the transitive property of congruency, we know that this angle here, angle UXW, is congruent to angle SUT. Well, we have corresponding angles now that are congruent. Since we have corresponding angles, by the converse of the corresponding angle postulate, we know the two lines are congruent. Excellent. Now, one last thing, when you get up here a little higher, I want to emphasize, they're going to have you do all three. So just look at what it's stating and look to see what could be the possible reasons. Now, the top one I will give you all the time is always given. Always given. UVX is congruent to QST. Well, they have those little red arc marks. That means it's given. That's just a given. That first one should always be given. Sometimes two lines are given, but not always. So, and then you just work your way through it. Now I know that QST, where's QST? QST is congruent to RSV. So this angle is congruent to this angle. Why? Well, they're vertical angles. So that's the vertical angle theorem. So I scan down here till I get to vertical angle theorem. Now I know UVX is congruent to angle RSV, because they are corresponding angles. Let's see, wait. Angle UVX is congruent to, by the transitive property, right? Because we knew that XVU was congruent to TSQ by given, and that was congruent to this angle. So by the transitive property of congruency, we know that they are congruent. Now we have corresponding angles that are congruent. Since corresponding angles are congruent, by the converse of the corresponding angle postulate, we know that they are true. Now, one last thing. I noticed that up here, be careful. In some proofs, there's an add line. You might have to put more steps. Look up at what it's asking. I'm trying to prove that two angles are congruent. Don't stop short. You need to walk through this. If you get to 86 and you're struggling, I would suggest you stop, get online, and ask me for help. Good luck, and we will hopefully talk to you in class.